Great to be here. I was asked on the way here by a couple of people what I plan to speak about today. I responded that I plan to speak about some aspects of overcoming. Actually, what I would like to focus on is what motivates us to want to change and overcome, and how we can help others in this process, or how we can make this process more difficult for others. There's a line in a song titled Holy Water. It gets repeated throughout the song. The line says, I don't want to abuse your grace. God, I need it every day. It's the only thing that really makes me want to change. So, it's the only thing that really makes me want to change. What really makes us want to change? Now, sometimes it's fear. And often fear is a great motivator. It can, and it does make us want to change. But how real, how deep, and how permanent are the changes motivated by fear? Will fear alone result in the real, deep, and permanent changes that we need to make and that we'd like to make? And what makes people want to change their moral and spiritual character and follow God's will? It's not fear alone. Fear alone won't do that. And what discourages them from doing that? Well, I'm not sure about you, but with me, the understanding that the more that I accept and understand that I'm literally a child of God and that He cares about me, the more I'm motivated to want to make positive changes and overcome. Throughout my life, I grew up in the world of religion, and throughout most of my life in that world, I was not very motivated to want to change. And I was not motivated when preachers would yell at me and criticize me and tell me how bad I was. My father was a preacher, and my father had a very, very sharp style of preaching. And he used to take pride in that he called it outspoken. There was an expression, I don't know if there's a comparable expression in English, but he would say in Spanish, Jackie, you probably know the expression, he would say, no tengo pelos en la lengua, which means I don't have any hair on my tongue. Which meant that, he would just tell you what he had to tell you, however it came out. He made no apologies for that. But I never found that motivating. But the understanding that I'm a child of God and that God cares about me, I found that to be a very powerful motivator, more than anything that I feared. In fact, in Romans chapter 2, verse 4, the aged apostle wrote, breaking into a thought, he said, or despises thou the riches of his goodness and forbearance and long suffering, not knowing that the goodness of God leads you to repentance. He said the goodness of God, not the punishment of God. God may need to punish, but he says the goodness of God leads us to repentance. Because in Revelation we read about people at the end of the age who will be so rebellious, and he says they will continue fighting and being angry at God despite punishment. Now, many of us have loved ones. You have your loved one here. We have our granddaughters that here with us, including children and grandchildren that we deeply care about. And we would love to see them faithfully following God's way. I keep hearing the... Turn it off?
Rhonda's not here, so.
Oh, okay. Can anyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, because I was hearing this static. I'll try to speak up. Okay, so we would love to see our loved ones following God's way. Now, we do know, or we should know, that Christ himself told us that no one can come to him unless the Father draws him. He indicated that twice in John chapter 6, verses 44 and 65. But even though we cannot make anyone come to Christ, we can make it easier or more difficult for them. I doubt that any believer would want to intentionally create a stumbling block for anyone on their journey to God's kingdom. One of the things that I want most is to know that God used me, even if in a small way, to encourage others, especially my loved ones. And at this point in my life, most especially my young granddaughter, because she's the youngest one that we have in our family, and that we have the greatest opportunity now with to encourage. The others, they're still young, but they're young adults. Their character is molded to a great degree, but they still need encouragement. But the younger ones, I think they need a little more encouragement, and we have a greater opportunity with them. I once went with a friend to a live presentation by the motivational speaker Les Brown. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Les Brown. So I got to see him live in New York. And Mr. Brown always acknowledges in his talk his mother. I was very impressed with that. He always acknowledges his mother. But it turned out, I found out at one point, that was not the mother. The woman that he always acknowledged was not his natural birth mother. That was his adopted mother. He and his twin brother had been abandoned on the floor of a crack house by his birth mother. And he was taken to this woman, which I believe her name was, I think he called her Mamie Brown. She was a poor woman, but she had a big heart. And I guess they knew she had a big heart. So she adopted him and his brother, as well as another, I believe it was 11 children. That evening that I went to see Mr. Brown, he was introduced by a woman who was the pastor of the church which hosted his event. Before his presentation, this woman, whose name I don't remember, but I will never forget her or forget what she said. She spoke a little bit about her background, which was somewhat similar to Les Brown's. And she spoke about how she came to be where she was. Both her parents had been crack addicts. Both ended up in prison. And if I recall correctly, both died young, leaving her an orphan. But she said that God gave her a guiding light. She said, God gave me one guiding light. It was her grandmother. Now, her grandmother did not keep Sabbath, as far as I know. But she said, according to her, she said that she tried to live by what she understood was God's will. She taught her that God loved her. And she raised her with a tremendous amount of love. And she taught her that she was valuable in God's sight, in God's eyes. That helped her develop the conviction that she was loved by God and that she did not have to be like her parents. It helped her overcome. And eventually she became the pastor of a church in New York. Fairly large. That wasn't a mega church, but it was a decent sized church. Don't you want to be like that grandmother? I do. And, I'd rather err on the side of mercy in attempting to help others overcome than to err on the side of pointing out how wrong or how sinful they are, even if it's true. I'd rather err on the side of mercy than to make it more difficult for someone to overcome. Now, I've been blessed with some really, really good friends, thank God, and one in particular who is very much like that grandmother to my own children and grandchildren. He's always ready to encourage, never takes advantage of any opportunity to judge, criticize, or complain, which is why even our little granddaughter, when she hears Ray is coming over, she smiles. And she says, "Oh, Ray is coming over." And my young adult daughters, one in New York and one in Puerto Rico, when they hear his name, I get a smile out of them. Well, one of them always smiles when she hears my name, but the other one, she doesn't necessarily smile when she hears my name. But he can say things in a way that, for some reason, sits better when he says it than when I say it. So today I want to speak about overcoming, particularly overcoming persistent challenges, including sins that beset us and tend to cause us to feel overwhelmed, maybe even hopeless. And I'd like to look at ways that we can help each other overcome and things that we should avoid doing that can make overcoming more difficult for some people. I won't necessarily do that in the way of points, but maybe with some narratives. I know some of us have recently been faced, and some of us right now are facing difficult circumstances, heart-rending circumstances. Circumstances that can make us feel like we're being crushed. Recently, and actually for quite some time, our own family, we've been in a similar situation with a number of different challenges. But thankfully, God has not failed to send us lifelines through some good friends and some family members. And sometimes we don't recognize, and consequently, we reject the lifelines that God sends us. Sometimes we need to ask, to seek out a lifeline. My good friend asked me recently, why didn't I call? So sometimes we do need to seek out lifelines. Sometimes we need to offer them. But many of us have been indoctrinated with the idea that overcoming is merely a matter of intention, will, and effort. What I call pressing the right button at the right time. But if this is the case, why would we need a miraculous salvation? If it's just our will and our intention and our effort, what's so miraculous about our salvation? I know of a number of historical figures who overcame incredible obstacles, and some of them were not self-proclaimed believers in Christ. I know a number who became authors, who became very well-known political figures, and they overcame great obstacles through their effort. But the overcoming the Bible speaks of, it requires miracles. King David wrote in Psalms, I believe this was a Psalm of David, Psalm 62, verses 1 through 2. And actually we sing these verses in a song. It says, "My soul waits in silence for God alone. My salvation comes from Him. He alone is my rock and salvation, my stronghold. I will not be greatly moved." If all we need to overcome a stubborn problem is to exercise our will and effort, shouldn't we be able to press the button and overcome, not just with that stubborn problem, but with every issue confronting us? When I was about 23 or 24, I'm just remembering, I met a guy from church who was a few years older than me. He needed a place to stay, and I let him move into my apartment. He had a very difficult situation at the time. So this young man, he was highly intelligent, and he was somewhat introverted, and I can say that because, like him, I was also somewhat introverted, so it takes one to know one. But unlike me, this guy had a really hard time relating to people. I was introverted, but I don't think I had that much of a hard time relating to people. Some people we knew tended to think of him as someone who was wound up kind of tightly. In some ways, he could make people feel very uncomfortable. He was very zealous, and in his zeal to help others, he would point out their faults. So on a Friday night, I came home to my apartment, and I had to literally stand between him and another frustrated young man who had recently come out of the military, who had become so enraged with him that in this young man's mind, the guy who came from the military, he was in a drug or alcohol fueled frenzy, perhaps even a demonically motivated frenzy. He hit him across the face and he pulled a knife on him. He threatened him with a big knife. And I said, oh boy, on a Friday night, what am I going to do? I jumped in between them. And I gambled, and I won this time, that this guy would not attack me. And he dropped the knife. He listened to me, he dropped the knife. And he did not go further with his threat. So I told the guy, who was a church member, I told him, okay, you got to leave tonight. So I took him, and I had to practically force him on a bus. And I took him to the home of another church member. So when we were on the bus, I noticed that he started hitting his fist. And he started repeating, I'm rejoicing, I'm rejoicing, I'm rejoicing. And I asked him, what are you doing? And he explained that he said Jesus commanded us to rejoice when we're persecuted for his name's sake. I said, in so many words, I said, well, you weren't really persecuted for his name's sake. You were persecuted for being obnoxious. But he had fully accepted the idea, though, that overcoming our challenges was a matter of harnessing our intention, engaging our will, and putting forth diligent effort. He had been in the military also. And he approached overcoming and living as a Christian with military discipline. Honestly, I also practiced a military-like discipline. I had never been in the military, but people had told me that I disciplined myself. I said, if I was in the military, I did that because I thought that was the way that I could maintain my sanity. I had some very difficult problems that I had to work on, and that's the only way I knew to work on them. But I came to understand intuitively that there were certain sins that I was struggling with. I knew I could not overcome them without God's miraculous intervention. I knew that no amount of discipline would enable me to succeed. But I felt that I needed to put forth that discipline so that I wouldn't fail. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I just knew that it was not my discipline that was going to bring it about. I knew I needed a miracle. But the word overcoming at that time was not a word that I would have used to describe my life. In fact, at that time I hated the word. It bothered me to even hear it. It irritated me when the topic was brought up at church or in articles. And unfortunately, most of my experiences growing up in the world of church and religion did not motivate me to pursue a relationship with God. In fact, a lot of these experiences actually pushed me in the wrong direction, pushed me away from anything having to do with God. There were various factors involved in this, but the following, which I'll list, just three, they seem to have been the main issues. Here's the first one. Although they spoke a lot about God at church, God did not seem real to me, or to me, it didn't seem like he was real to the people who were telling me about him. It didn't seem to me that many church people really believed in what they were saying. For example, I grew up in the charismatic Pentecostal religion. They spoke a lot about miraculous healings and deliverances. I saw none of it, ever. I remember once walking home, I think I was playing ball, and I was coming from the park, and there was a big old evangelistic campaign out in the street in this park, a big park. And there was a very well-known, he was a Hispanic evangelist, and he was well-known for healings and miracles and all of this stuff. So I said, well, let me take a look. Let me see what happens. So I stood there watching. I didn't see anybody get healed. So I saw a guy brought his elderly mother or grandmother in a wheelchair. And the young guy said, look, she's still not healed. You prayed for her. She's still not healed. And the guy said something like, it's not my problem if she doesn't have the faith to be healed. and I just remembered, it just like, it didn't sit well with me. And I did not get the sense that that world really believed that God was real. They also spoke a lot about God's love and mercy, but I remember a lot of self-righteous hatred almost towards people they considered sinners. And even as a kid, I was aware that I was a sinner. I didn't go around telling everybody about it, but I knew I was a sinner. So when I was hearing them condemn sinners, I was feeling condemned. Another factor was that they rarely addressed in a compassionate way the real challenges and struggles with sin that people experience, especially young people, especially kids. And I was a kid. I was struggling. I knew it. I was struggling with sin. On the contrary, they would rail against those who had spiritual weaknesses as if they wanted to bring the wrath of God upon them. So I never felt like I could go to these people and ask them to help me. And the third factor was that they adopted, even when some wanted to help, they adopted a simplistic approach that I can best summarize as just say no, or just choose. As if every challenge could be easily resolved, every sin could be effortlessly overcome with a mere decision. Just make a choice. Everything to them seemed to be a simple choice, like choosing chocolate or vanilla at an ice cream store. So, rarely did I ever see anyone acknowledge even the possibility that someone could have a monumentally difficult time dealing with an issue or overcoming a particular sin, whether that be a behavior or a mindset, or that someone could, through no choice of their own, or no fault of their own, find themselves struggling in that situation. I'll give you an example of what I mean. About 15 or more years ago, I learned that someone very close to me, had put up his young son for adoption. He was 6 years old at the time. This little boy had been neglected by his mother, who had mental illness, and she was on drugs. His father, a Vietnam veteran, who also struggled with his own dysfunctions, including PTSD, drug use, and all sorts of other dysfunctions. But he realized that he was not able to be the father that this young boy needed. So at least he had that much clarity. And without calling his family members to see if anyone could take his son, he just put his son up for adoption. This little boy had been left alone by his mother at a large establishment where people generally take kids for games and food. She just left him there. He was rescued. Another time, she had apparently allowed him to leave the house by himself. They lived near the desert. And he was found wandering around the desert for a few days. He was 4 years old at the time. Eventually, he was put into the foster care system, and I heard that he was placed with a really nice family. So hopefully his family provided a wholesome and loving environment that helped him heal after the trauma he experienced. But is it inconceivable that this little boy, he's now a young man, is it inconceivable that he might have developed some dysfunctional ways of dealing with the pain in his life? What choices did he make? Was that a choice? What fault did he have in this? How would it help him if church people told him all he had to do was make the right choices and put forth the necessary effort? Yes, he had to make the right choices, but it would take more than just the right choices, and it would definitely take God's intervention. So I'm just thinking about another young man. many years after the church that we were members of had broken up, I attended a get-together with some guys. I was invited to a barbecue. It was just the guys there. And so we all got together at the home of a friend in Queens. And one of the guys mentioned that he had happened to come across a young man that most of us knew. He had attended Worldwide with us, and he served in different ways for many years. I never knew the guy well, but I did know him. And he always seemed like a nice guy, friendly person, and he seemed dedicated, and he always seemed willing to serve people. I always got the impression that he was a genuine believer, and he wanted to obey God. But at this barbecue, one of the guys in the group, when he brought him up, started mocking this young man and pretending that he had exaggerated feminine gestures. And then, almost in concert, the entire group of these guys began laughing and railing on this guy. And at that moment, I wondered, wow, is this the way you treated him when you went to church with him? You know, I still believe that at least some of them must have occasionally slipped and let their contempt for him show while he was attending church with them. And I wasn't surprised that he had stopped attending and never came back. Now, I got angry at myself because, I just stared at them in disgust. But I'm ashamed to say that I did not protest, and I didn't make an attempt to call out their behavior. I think now I would do differently. But do you think these guys could have done anything to help this young man in his struggles to overcome? Do you think they made it easier or more difficult for him? We were not called to mock anyone, let alone someone that we call a brother, who, as far as we know, is trying to overcome sin and obey God. So I think sometimes we have to ask ourselves, do we want to help others overcome? Or do we want to righteously point out their faults, ridicule them, and make them feel like garbage? Messiah said we are to be like our Father in heaven. Everyone he met was a sinner. Not one of them was righteous or pure. I did say that John the Baptist's parents were blameless, not pure. If anyone was in a position to judge, condemn, mock, or ridicule sinners, it was Messiah. But he never did. In fact, he warned in Matthew 18, verses 6 through 7, "But whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck, and that he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe unto the world because of offenses! For it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense comes." Excuse me. Some people that Messiah met were hopelessly bound by evil. Some of them literally possessed by demons. Let's just consider one of them. It's one of my favorite accounts in the Gospels. I'm reading from Mark. You'll read the story of Mark chapter 1. Just jump in and out through the narrative, starting with verse 1. And I'm reading from the Complete Jewish Bible. It says, Yeshua and his Talmidim arrived at the other side of the lake, in the Gerasenes' territory. As soon as he disembarked, a man with an unclean spirit came out of the burial caves to meet him. He lived in the burial caves, and no one could keep him tied up, not even with a chain. He had often been chained hand and foot, but he would snap the chains and break the irons off his feet, and no one was strong enough to control him. Night and day he wandered among the graves and through the hills, howling and gnashing himself with stones. He was cutting himself. He was self-harming. Now, in another account of the same event, it says that he lived out there naked, and I'm sure he didn't smell good. continuing in verse 6, it says, seeing Yeshua from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him and screamed at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Yeshua, Son of God, Ha'elyon? I implore you in God's name, don't torture me." This is not the man speaking. This was the demonic force. For Yeshua had already begun saying to him, "Unclean spirit, come out of this man." Yeshua asked him, "What's your name?" "My name is Legion," he answered. "There are so many of us." And he kept begging Yeshua not to send him out of that region. So we know the story. The demons asked to be allowed to go into a herd of pigs. Yeshua gave them permission, and the herd ran into the ocean and drowned. And that terrified those people there. And they actually asked him to leave. They begged him to leave. That is, they begged Yeshua to leave. But in verse 18 it says, as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demonized begged him to be allowed to go with him. But Yeshua would not permit it. Instead he said, "Go home to your people and tell them how much Adonai in his mercy has done for you." So he had mercy on this demon-possessed, scary, smelly man. Now, I've seen many church people throughout the years use Romans 1, especially verses 24 through 28, as a weapon against sinners that they can easily condemn. It's a way of like hitting the low-hanging fruit. These verses speak about, it says that, I'll just read in and out quickly, verse 24, "Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness for the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections, for even the women that change the natural use that into that which is against nature, and likewise men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burn in their lust one toward another, men with men, working what is unseemly, and receiving in themselves the recompense of their error." That's verse 27. Okay, so statistically speaking, if you were to remove everyone described in these verses, you might take out about 10% of the church population. Because they have found that most churches, and it's unfortunate, but they have found that the problems experienced in society are mirrored in the churches to pretty much the same degree, percentage-wise. So, people described in these verses statistically represent about 10% of the population, and I'm going to extrapolate and say, okay, so it's about 10%. We just remove 10%. But what about verses 29 through 31? It keeps going. It says, "Being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful." Now, what percentage would fall in these categories?
The other 90.
Okay. And how many of us will fall in the category described in chapter 2, verses 2 to 3? It says, "Therefore, you are inexcusable, O man, whoever you are, who judge. Because," it said, "for wherein," in Old English, "wherein thou judgest another, thou condemnest thyself. For," let me just say it in modern English, for you who judge, do the same things. But we are sure that the judgment of God is according to truth against them which commit such things. And do you think, O man, that judge them which do such things, and do the same things, that you shall escape the judgment of God?" So, what percentage would fall into that category? And now how many people do we have left? I'm reminded of of a minister many years ago in the New York area. He said, if we try to sift out everyone we don't like and keep sifting and sifting, eventually we'll be left with no one. Anyway, some of us seem to be afraid to acknowledge that our success at overcoming does not depend entirely on our effort. It's almost a fear. But refusing to accept that God may allow us, for reasons that we may not understand even in this life, refusing to accept that God may allow us to deal with an intense struggle for a long time could result in depression. It could result in profound depression. It could result in resentment towards God. If we have this mindset that we just need to perform more effort, and if we're not able to overcome an issue, a problem, it could be a relationship problem, family problem, it could be a temptation we're struggling against. If we convince ourselves or allowed ourselves to be convinced that it just depends on our effort, and if we're not gaining ground, the ground that we think we should gain, then something must be wrong with us. And if we can't accept that, then something must be wrong with God. He must be unjust. Can't he see how hard I'm trying? And I got to tell you, I've been there and I've done that. I struggled with that. But let's do a thought experiment. Let's imagine that each of our sins and spiritual challenges is represented by a button. We have a button for each one. We can make them all disappear by just pressing the right buttons. Okay, so line them all up in your minds. Assign a button to each one. Now press the buttons for the ones you want to get rid of. Actually, you can go ahead and press all of them. So now you've pressed every button. There's nothing left to press. So what's the point after that? Is there any point in praying? Is there any point in fasting? Is there any point in trying? You don't have to change anything because you've pressed every button. You've overcome everything. Do we need to fellowship and share our experiences? What experiences? What could we share? All we did was press a bunch of buttons. And that's all you need to do. That's all you need to do. That's a very simple, very fast conversation. And why will God keep us around? Why doesn't God just say, okay, you're done. It's time for you to sleep. Throughout my years on this journey, trying to follow God's way, I heard a lot about overcoming. I was baptized in May of 1976. I was 19. But soon after my baptism, I became profoundly discouraged because despite strenuous and consistent efforts, I saw I was not able to overcome sins that I knew I had to overcome. And I actually started thinking, in the beginning, I started thinking, you know what, I knew this was not real. It was just too good to be true. I gave up, and I went back to my old life. But thankfully, God interrupted that process and brought me back. But still, soon after I was baptized, I was confronted with an unexpected challenge that so totally shocked me it almost destroyed my faith. And here's a summary of my thinking at the time. Why did I have to continue having such a fierce struggle against sin? What was wrong? What was wrong with me? I wanted to obey God. I wanted to be overcome. I wanted to be pleasing to God. And I tried really hard. But despite my best efforts, I kept failing. So, was I even converted? In fact, one minister said, not to me. He had not even, in fact, I never counseled with him. But he told another minister that I probably was not converted. And of course, at the time, I figured, oh, he must know, he's the expert. I believed it. But then reading certain scriptures, that were meant for our encouragement and edification. But because of the way we spoke about this topic, they made me feel worse. I'll give you one example. Romans 6, verse 12 to 14. It says, therefore, do not let sin rule in your mortal body, so that it makes you obey its desires, and do not offer any part of yourselves to sin as an instrument for wickedness. On the contrary, offer yourselves to God as people, alive from the dead, and your various parts to God as instruments for righteousness. For sin will not have authority over you, because you are not under legalism, but under grace. Well, that was my goal. And that was my sincere intention. That is to not let sin rule in my life. I did everything I learned I should do to help myself succeed in overcoming. I prayed, I fasted, I studied the Bible, I meditated. I regularly attended services, Bible study, and as much as possible I took advantage of every opportunity for service and fellowship. And I did make progress. But at first, only incrementally. But even many years later, some forms remained, despite my sincerest intentions and my best efforts. Eventually, I came to learn that even Paul the Apostle struggled with this reality. He had the same struggle. And he wrote in 2 Corinthians 12:9, my gift, well, let me just put it in context. He said that he prayed 3 times. He said he had a thorn given him. He said it was a messenger of Satan sent to buffet him. And it must have been pretty bad because Paul went through a lot of suffering. And as we would say today, he just took it in stride. But this must have been bad because he said he prayed he says he begged the Lord 3 times. And he said, I'm reading from the Contemporary English Version, but he replied, my gift of undeserved grace is all you need. My power is strongest when you are weak. So we may be looking at someone, if we come to know of their struggle, their persistent struggle, and we, in our thinking, could come up with some explanation. Oh, that person, they may not be sincere, they may not be converted, whatever it is. We may not be realizing that this could be the person that God said to, my gift of undeserved grace is all you need. My power is strongest when you are weak. And there are reasons for that. So what does it mean to overcome? So overcoming is defined as succeeding in dealing with a problem or difficulty, or defeating an opponent, and also prevailing. And what does it mean? What does the word mean in the biblical text, especially in the what we call the New Testament? Revelation 2 verse 7, it says, he that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. Excuse me. To him that overcometh will I give to eat of the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God. The Common English Bible translates that as follows. If you can hear, listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. I will allow those who emerge victorious to eat from the tree of life, which is in God's paradise. The Greek word for overcome in that passage is nikao. And it means to conquer, to overcome, to prevail, to gain victory. And that verb is used in the New Testament to describe the act of overcoming or gaining victory, often in a spiritual or moral context. Okay, so you might be thinking, well, that's nothing new. Tell me something I didn't know, Sherlock. We know that. Well, let's continue. This is from, I believe this helps word studies. It says, it conveys the idea of triumphing over adversaries, challenges, or enemies. And in the helps word studies, it says, the verb implies a battle. Now, I know some people, and I've known some people who insist, or they seem to believe, that once we have God's Spirit, we have the ability to resist and overcome any and every sin. Some seem to believe, even without any notable distress. We do. We have God's Spirit. We have the ability to resist any sin, but it doesn't mean it won't be a battle. It doesn't mean you could put on that armor. It doesn't mean you won't have a battle. That's why you put on the armor, because you're going to go into battle. And battles aren't pretty. Battles aren't fun.
That's right.
In other words, some people think that you could do this without much of a battle. And if you have a battle or any notable distress, something's wrong. I wonder if Paul knew that when he wrote the letter to the Romans, especially chapter 7. Those words, to me, sure seem to describe an excruciating and even a frustrating battle. I'll just read Romans chapter 7, starting verse 14. We'll start in verse 15. Verse 15, it says, "For I do not understand what I am doing, because I do not practice what I want to do, but what I hate." That's from the Christian Standard Bible. Now, if I do what I do not want to do, I agree with the law that it is good. So now, I am no longer the one doing it, but it's sin living in me. For I know that nothing good lives in me, that is in my flesh. For the desire to do what is good is with me, but there's no ability to do it. For I do not do the good that I want to do, but I practice the evil that I do not want to do. Now, if I do what I do not want, I'm no longer the one that does it, but it's the sin that lives in me. And I think most of us would agree that Paul was an overcomer. But had he overcome when he wrote this letter to the Romans, including the words we just read in chapter 7? If overcoming is finally succeeding in dealing with a problem or a difficulty, or defeating an opponent, can anyone really be said to have overcome until he or she has fully succeeded? Until the problem, the difficulty, the opponent is dead? I've thought about that often. Okay, so let's say you're watching a battle between, let's say, a knight and a dragon. Okay, so the knight is gaining ground. He's got the dragon on his back. In fact, he's beating this dragon. This dragon is almost dead. He's ready to render the final blow. The dragon is nearly defeated, but suddenly the dragon summons the strength to knock the knight off his chest onto the ground. Smacks him with his tail. Now the knight is injured. But he doesn't give up. He gets up and he continues fighting. He's prevailing in the process of overcoming. And he'll prevail until he strikes the final blow. So obviously, in one sense, until the knight strikes the final blow that kills the dragon, technically, we cannot say he has conquered it. But if overcoming includes prevailing in the process, isn't he overcoming in the present moment? So is it the same with us? Romans chapter 8 verse 37 says, "Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us." Now, trying to think of another word, as some people might say, as anal as they can be. I looked up the scripture in 38 English translations. Okay. Yes, I looked up Romans 8 verse 37 in 38 English translations. Curiously, 33 of these translations describe this condition. He says we are more than conquerors. Describes this condition using the present tense. That is, we are present tense, more than conquerors. Curiously, 2 translations place the overcoming in the past tense. Common English Version and the Worldwide English New Testament says, he has helped us win the victory in the past tense. Only one translation placed it in the future tense. I tried to get the sense in the Greek, but it seems to be written in the present tense. If we extrapolate using the 1,000 years is like a day already gone, this is what Moses wrote, the Song of Moses. He said 1,000 years to the Creator is like yesterday already gone by. And then he said, or a few hours in the night, or a night watch. So if we extrapolate and we use that as our standard, 1 hour would be equivalent to roughly 41 years. 2 hours would be comparable to about 82 years, slightly longer than the average lifespan in the United States today, which is, they say, 79.4 years. So about 7 or 8 years ago, I started wondering about a lot of things. I started wondering about that and wondering about time. I started thinking about my 1.5 hour, based on the thousand year for a day metaphor. And I started wondering, what am I doing with the relative 15 or 30 minutes that I have left, that I may have left? And I also started thinking, how did I get here? How did I get in my life circumstances to where I am now? I started asking, what mistakes did I make? What wrong choices got me here? What right choices got me here? And I started thinking something that actually scared me. What mistakes am I making now that I'm blind to, that's going to take me to a future present moment that I never anticipated? And that, I gotta be honest with you, that does haunt me every now and then. Now, I'm not sure that we could ever really navigate this journey without making any serious mistakes that we may later regret. It may not be possible. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't try. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to do our best at every moment. But honestly, can anyone really do their best at every moment? If you can, then it's not your best. You can't always do your best, because then the word becomes meaningless. But again, it doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Now, believe me, I'm speaking to myself when I say this. I have to constantly remind myself to be aware, to be more self-aware of the way I behave in the present moment, the way I speak to others, the way I treat others, and I don't always do my best. Unfortunately, the closer we are in relationship to others, the more likely we are to offend and to get offended. Now, some people have thicker skin than others, and they're not offended that easily. But I'm often surprised how sometimes without thinking, we may ask questions knowing that we will probably receive an answer we don't like or don't agree with, and will almost certainly challenge, almost as if we're looking for an argument. And the instant we ask the question and have the argument, then we realize, oh, I didn't do that well in that present moment. But again, we can't always do our best, but we try. Now, granted, we may have started our journey with a deficit. I did. I was a survivor of a dysfunctional, in many ways, abusive upbringing. But thankfully, I did answer God's call. And as the psalmist wrote, I hoped, and I still hope in His mercy. And I trusted, and I still trust in statements recorded in the Scripture as promises from the Creator, for example, such as Psalm 34, verse 15, has always been, for me, a guiding light. Psalm 34, verses 15 through 22, says, the eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, and His ears are open unto their cry. Not that I'm righteous, but I believe that through Christ, God sees me as righteous as long as I continue repenting and trying to do His will. But the psalm continues, the face of the Lord is against them that do evil. And my understanding is He's not referring to an act of evil that one may commit out of weakness, but living habitually, committing evil carelessly or intentionally. Says the face of the Lord is against them that do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. The righteous cry, and the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. The Lord is near unto them that are of a broken heart, and save such as be of a contrite spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. He keeps all his bones, not one of them is broken. Evil shall slay the wicked, and they that hate the righteous shall be desolate. The Lord redeems the soul of his servants, and none of them that trust in him shall be desolate. Now the Hebrew word translated as desolate in this psalm is asham, meaning to be guilty, to offend, to trespass. So I wondered, what's the psalmist saying? That none of them that trust in God will be objectively guilty, will never be guilty? Or that they will never offend? Or that they will never trespass? Or was he saying that none who trust in God will be held guilty? I won't give you the answer, I'll just let you think about that. Let's read Paul's statement from Romans 8 with a little more context. Romans 8, starting verse 35. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword? As it is written, for thy sake we are killed all the day long. We are accounted as sheep for the slaughter. Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. Now let's go back to verse 11. It says, but if the spirit of him that raised up Jesus from the dead dwell in you, he that raised up Christ from the dead shall also quicken your mortal bodies by his spirit that dwelleth in you. Therefore, brethren, we are debtors, not to the flesh, to live after the flesh. For if you live after the flesh, you shall die. But if you, through the Spirit, do mortify the deeds of the body, you shall live. For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. For you have not received the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption, whereby we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit itself bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if so be that we suffer with him, that we may be also glorified together. For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed in us. Now, jumping down to verse 26, likewise, the Spirit also helps our infirmities. For we know not what we should pray for as we ought, but the Spirit itself makes intercession for us with groanings which cannot be uttered. I'm not sure about you, but there are times that I cannot even articulate words. And I still go in my closet, and sometimes all I could do is sit there. Sometimes I listen to worship music. But I remember these words. We know not how to pray, but the Spirit makes intercession for us. It says, and he that searches the hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because he makes intercession for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that we might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he did predestinate, them he also called. And whom he called, them he also justified. And whom he justified, them he also glorified. You notice it's all written in the past tense. But it hasn't happened yet. But it's written in the past tense. What shall we say? What shall we then say to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us? He that spared not his Son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with him also freely give us all things? Who shall lay anything to the charge of God's elect? It is God that justifies. Who is he that condemns? It is Christ that died. Yes, rather, that is written again, who is even at the right hand of God, who also makes intercession for us. This is also an aspect of overcoming. That whether or not we realize it, Christ makes intercession for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword, as it is written, for thy sake we are killed all the day long. We are accounted as sheep for the slaughter. Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. For I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other creature shall be able to separate us from the love of God which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. So if you get only one thing from my rambling message today, I want everyone hearing my voice, either online or in this room, or anyone who might hear this message later, from the oldest to the youngest being Makai and Sophia. I won't guess who's the oldest here, but it's probably me. I'd like you to focus on one message in this passage. It's in verse 37. In God's timeless dimension, he sees us in his mind already as more than conquerors. The same way he saw life before it existed. So it's not a theoretical thing. I've heard a lot of people say, we take the Bible literally. Okay? So if he says, we are, present tense, more than conquerors, can we take that literally? So if God says that he sees what will be as if it existed now. If we imagine anything, an enterprise, a business, a building, in our imagination, then we design it. Then it gets constructed, and we bring it to life. And that's with our puny little minds. What do we say about the Creator? If he sees us in his mind as already more than conquerors, the same way he saw life before it existed in material form, does not that mean that we are? We are conquerors. We're overcoming. We're in the process. Now, notice also verse 39. No powers. Nothing that currently exists, it says. Nothing that exists in our present moment. Nothing that may come to pass. Nothing that may challenge us in the future. Doesn't that mean then, I would think, that he's kind of looking at our lifespan. And he's making sure that nothing in the future will be able to separate us. Now it says nothing can separate us from the love of God. Nothing to me means nothing. And in my perspective, it includes even our most powerful weaknesses. One of the things that, I don't mean to digress too much, but one of the things that used to bother me a lot about the way I would hear people talk about overcoming, they would tell us we have to be hyper vigilant because, you could fall and you could slide down, the hill, and you better make sure, you pray every night before you go to bed, and you commit a sin and fall on your knees immediately. You're on the subway, just like, hypervigilance. But yet it says nothing that currently exists, nothing that may come can separate us from the love of God. Now, I'm not advocating for sinning and being casual about it, so please don't misconstrue my words. I'm just saying that God's got us, as my friend really likes to say. Nothing means nothing. Not even our most powerful weaknesses. Not even our difficulties in overcoming. Nothing could separate us from the love of God.